Imagine just walking, minding your own business, when in the middle of the snow, you spot something shiny, yet dangerous, and it starts flying at you. How in the world did this happen? So the biggest new addition to my game is the ice zone. Going into the zone, I wanted it to be unique from the desert zone. So I wanted each zone to have its own theme. The desert zone, the theming is wood. So for the most part, all the enemies are made out of wood, as well as the boss. For this zone, it's a frozen tundra that has been overrun by machines. Going off of this, the artist I work with made all this great art, so I got to work right away. I started to think of how I can make each of these enemies unique, and that brings me to my first one, this tiny machine. This machine acts as a sort of kamikaze, where it goes directly at the player, and when it's ready to attack, it'll charge at the player. This doesn't create any projectiles. Instead, the projectiles are made when an enemy dies. This makes it interesting during fights, since it adds a new element into the combat where you have to think about when you're killing the enemy. Next up with this tank enemy. This tank enemy, I wanted the shots to be explosive. So I had the tank slow moving, and it just creates a line of 3 different bullets. These bullets are explosive, just making them a little bit more dangerous. The bullets also appear over time, giving the player a little bit of extra time to dodge the bullets. Next up was the mortar. This was the first enemy that was completely stationary. Since this enemy is not going to be moving, I wanted it to be a little more dangerous than the other ones. I made it so these bullets have a little bit of a homing onto the player. Next up was this tiny UFO. It moves very quickly at the player, slowing down to bring out a laser beam. This laser beam spins 360 directions trying to hit the player. This just brings another new enemy type in that makes each of them feel different. Last up was this machine that I had no idea what to call it. I had a vision of what I want the attack to be, which was a star. So I got that implemented. It creates this star and then shoots it at the player. These 5 enemies already felt way different than the desert enemies. And then I got to the good part, the boss fight. So the art I was given was this giant UFO with 2 big turrets on the side. I knew I wanted these turrets to have their own behavior separate from the UFO. And so I made it pretty simple. They just go back and forth firing at the player. Now on to the actual UFO. So the big gimmick between this boss fight and the other one is these machines in the corner. This UFO will cycle between 2 attacks. The first one's pretty simple. It'll fire a laser beam at the ground and shoot a bunch of projectiles in a circle around it. The second attack isn't as direct. It'll fly to one of the machines in the corner and heal itself up. Doing so will also overload this machine. And then after a certain period of time, this machine will also fire at the player. And it has 2 different patterns to pick from. Some explosive bullets or a line of bullets. This fight already felt way different from the buckethead enemy, as the buckethead was a lot more direct with its attacks. This fight has bullets flying in from all different directions, so the player has to be a lot more careful. After I had all of this implemented, I wanted to make the wave system better. So let me explain how it works now. Player first loads into an arena. It'll pick 2 enemies out of a pool of 3 for the area. These 3 enemies are the most basic enemies of the area. From the ice zone, it can pick from the kamikaze, the tank, or the UFO. Now during a wave, it'll only spawn these enemies. This just allowed the player to get warmed up to the area a lot better. Now after 2 waves, it'll pick a new enemy to put into this pool. This new enemy can be picked from any of the 5. This gave me a lot more control over when enemies are going to show up, as I wanted more complicated patterns to show up later on during an arena. So this new enemy could be the mortar, the star machine, or the enemy it didn't pick before. After 2 more waves, it can pick another enemy to add to this pool. This just made it so more enemies will show up over time, as well as having an added benefit where every time a player gets into an arena, they can see different enemies off the start, and it made each run feel a little bit more unique. With this new wave system, I went back and made sure the desert zone worked too, and I made sure that the simple enemies show up first, giving the player time to warm up to the run. Whoa, before I show you anything else, did you know I have a Discord server? Be sure to go check that out. In that Discord server, I give teasers for this game, so if you like where the game's going and you want to see a little bit extra, go to the link in the description and check it out. You can also talk to me there, and if you have any suggestions, that's a great way to talk to me. So once again, go to the link in the description and check it out. Now let's get back to the video. With all this stuff in, I wanted to make sure to go back and polish them. That's exactly what I did. I went back to the buckethead boss fight and added some particles just to make it a little more intense. I did the same thing for the UFO boss. I also added a little bit of squash and stretch for when an enemy is going to attack, just giving a little bit of anticipation so the player can get ready for the attack. Another small thing I did is whenever bullet patterns are appearing, I have the bullets pop in over time so the player can see the pattern appear over time. This is another small change that just gives the player a little more anticipation getting ready to dodge. Another small thing of polish I added was a simple hit flash onto the enemies. I also added some impact lines for when they're hit. This already made the combat feel a lot better. Now onto the weapons. I'll show off 2 more of the weapons. So this weapon is a Untitled bow. It's a very high damage but slow firing weapon. But the interesting thing is that dodging will actually reload the weapon. This will just incentivize the player to take haste stats along the run, as it'll make their dodge come back quicker, which will also allow them to shoot quicker. This already made the weapon feel way different than the other ones, where the player has to fall into a rhythm of shooting and dodging, but making sure they're not dodging into bullets. Now the 2 paths that you can go with this weapon are pretty straightforward. One of them doubles the charge time, but it'll make it shoot 3 arrows side to side. Doubling the charge time doesn't make a huge difference, as you're going to be dodging to reload your weapon normally anyways, but it just adds a little bit of a downside just in case. The other path is also pretty straightforward. It just adds homing to the arrows. And once again, both of these paths can be picked together if you get both a void and an amethyst infusion to show up during the run. The next weapon is this explosive boomerang. The boomerang can pierce through many enemies, and it causes an explosion on each one hit. This is great for clearing waves of enemies, but it's pretty weak for single target damage. It also has a pretty low range, and that's where the infusions come in. The amethyst path is pretty unique, as it'll make it so the boomerang gets more range the more accuracy the player has. This will just allow the option for the player to build into a certain stat to increase the range. The void infusion is a little bit different. Instead of just changing it so the two boomerangs throw out side by side in a V pattern, this just plays into the strength of the boomerang, where it's really good at clearing waves of enemies, but it makes it even worse for single target damage, as it's a little bit harder to aim at an enemy directly in front of you. Now that I have both these zones in, it makes it a lot easier to play test it, as I'm already able to go through a little bit of a run and get a feel for the game. I've already started work on the jungle zone, which is the next zone, but here's a few of the enemies that we have planned, one of them being a goblin and one of them being an armadillo. We already have the attacks planned out, and it's looking like it's going to be really good, so make sure you subscribe if you want to see how that area turns out. The next thing to do is to go through these zones and polish them up, as well as starting to add decorations. I want to get the game into a bit of a demo state, or a vertical slice. This will just allow me to send it to my friends so they can test it out. It'll also make these videos a lot nicer to look at. Pretty happy with how the combat looks, so making these arenas a little bit nicer to look at is just a great next step. I also have plans for a sort of NPC and challenge system, but I'm not going to go into detail just yet. You're probably going to hear about that in a later video. So if you want to see where this game goes, make sure you subscribe. And if you liked the video, leave a like down below and comment any ideas you have. Thanks for watching. See ya.